Hello, and welcome to another Northstar Talks Politics. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat focused here. This is a discussion of the fierce moral urgency of long COVID, a disease which, disclaimer, I am disabled with myself, and this is a disease that is killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people around the globe, is affecting the quality of life of over 140 million people around the globe, and is not being dealt with adequately. First of all, this is an article in the Journal of Global Health titled Is Long COVID the Next Global Health Crisis? The rapid development and deployment of coronavirus disease 19, COVID 19 vaccines should be heralded as a feat of true scientific collaboration that saved millions of lives. Despite the success, vaccines do not offer complete protection against infection, mild and severe disease, and the development of a long-term complex symptom profile commonly referred to as long COVID. Long COVID results from a positive infection with severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. Note that is SARS-CoV-2 because it is part of the same family as SARS pandemic in the past, and MERS, by the way, MERS, the virus that causes COVID-19 for coronavirus 19, because there were other coronaviruses in the past, not all of which went pandemic. It used ribonucleic acid, which is prone to replication population, leading to transmission of variants that are a threat to global health. SARS-CoV-2 is known to evolve at an approximate rate of 1.1 times 10 to negative 3 substitutions per site per year, equivalent to a single substitution. This is a base pair substitution type mutation they're referring to every 11 days. There are other types of mutations that can have much greater effects, but often those will result in non-viable viruses or something that's so distinct it's almost an entirely new virus. Not always, though. Whilst not all mutations pose a threat to public and global health, previous variants include Omicron and Delta. Previous variants, including Omicron and Delta, are widely regarded as variants of concern. Data highlights there's no difference in risk levels between Delta and Omicron, blah, blah, blah. These variants are characterized by some mutations that affect the spike protein, increased transmissibility. I'd like to emphasize increase in infection that is, in transmissibility and infectivity of the virus is going on over time. It's becoming more contagious over time, which is what you would expect with a virus that has gone to be a chronic issue for the globe and is not being wiped out. It just keeps coming back year after year. The latest, but here's what I really wanted to highlight before I finish with this article here. The latest data highlight that vaccines only offer a 15% reduction against developing long COVID, that is risk reduction, a 34% reduction in the risk of mortality. Furthermore, clinical features are indistinguishable in those that were vaccinated and subsequently contracted SARS-CoV-2 to pair with those with long COVID that were unvaccinated. While data sets remain infrequent, more than 144 million people globally are living with multidimensional and episodic symptoms that broadly impact functional status and quality of life. This is compounded by economic and societal drivers contributing to an increasing burden of long COVID in the global population. It's worth noting that more and more people are developing long COVID because the virus is still going around. And as it very clearly states here, even vaccinated people are still getting long COVID. In fact, there's only a 15% risk reduction with the vaccine. Initial studies showed as high as 50%, but either they were overestimating the risk reduction or mutations in the virus have led to the vaccines providing less protection over time. Either way, we now know it's a much smaller risk reduction against long COVID than was initially thought. I myself am sometimes guilty going back to these older numbers, just as people will sometimes say it's only 65 million worldwide, when newer data shows it's over 144 million. Rather, the initial studies were too conservative. They underestimated so that they wouldn't get in trouble for saying a number that was too high. But then more data also became available. It's over 144 million. And here is a bit from CBS Health Watch. I'm going to get into this. I'm going to take a moment here to explain and discuss here after this.
As the White House braces for a winter surge in COVID cases, the CDC is learning more about long COVID. A new study shows of the more than 1 million COVID deaths reported from January 2020 to June of 22, Long COVID is to blame for more than 3,500 of them, but researchers also acknowledge that number is, in reality, likely higher.
Yep. And I'd like to also emphasize this is just for a 2 year period. Long COVID, as far as we know, usually is for life. So if it leads to 3,500 deaths compared to a million, but that's just in a 2 year period, and people will be infected for 40 years often before they end up dead of old age or something. You can do the math. That's going to be something like 140,000. So it's going to be about 14% of the number of people who initially died who are going to end up dead due to long COVID in the long run if we don't come up with a cure and this goes on for another, say, 40 years. And actually worse because there's every evidence that people with long COVID, their health gets steadily worse. So the death rate should go up, not down over time.
For more
And
on
this
this,
is
I want to bring in Dr.
underestimate.
Tina Shaw. She's a
Underestimate.
pulmonologist and served as senior advisor to the U.S. Surgeon General from August 2021 to this past April. A warm welcome to you this morning. Just help for our viewers explain what exactly constitutes long COVID. How do you know you have it?
Good morning, Errol. Long COVID is essentially defined as when you've had COVID and you continue to have symptoms in that period of weeks to even months after you've had your initial episode of COVID. And really, long COVID can affect nearly any organ system. So I'm going to list off some of the top symptoms that people have. One big
I'd like to note she's mentioned the diagnostic criteria. If symptoms last more a certain time, we say it's long COVID. That's not that they go away after that time. It's that you won't consider it long COVID if the symptoms don't last at least that long. And usually, if they do last that long, they just stay with the person. The evidence shows for most people for the rest of their life, it just doesn't go away. There was some early studies that said the symptoms went away. The science was bad. Basically, people stopped seeing their doctor about symptoms, or they stopped seeing the research. The doctors who were part of the research study, sometimes they would just go into other doctors, and the studies were saying, oh, they don't have long COVID symptoms anymore. No, they still had the symptoms. They just stopped coming to see doctors about it. Not to mention doctors get frustrated, or as people's economic situations decline, they have bad health insurance, they get screwed out of healthcare. For instance, I've had my PCPs just cancel appointments on me a very large amount. It might be there's a PCP shortage, but it's become quite frequent where they cancel a 6 month follow up and then it'll be 3 more months and they cancel that. And I'll end up seeing just the PCP like less than once a year on average. And specialist appointments, it gets very frustrating to make these appointments and there's nothing they can do for you. So a lot of people just stop going to the doctors, but they're still sick.
Category is in the range of neurological symptoms. You may be feeling a brain fog where it's hard to sort of think. You may have
no heart attacks and heart failure and strokes, all potentially lethal, and this is part of what contributes to long COVID killing people.
Headaches. You may have trouble sleeping. You may even have a depressed mood or anxiety. A second big category is respiratory symptoms. You may continue to have a cough. You may find yourself still short of breath. You may also have chest pain or palpitations. You can have
had those for a while, for a number of months. The palpitations eventually went away, but I still get the chest pain intermittently.
Diarrhea, and you can have a rash. So as you can see, long COVID
still
really
get the rashes
manifests
periodically.
over a wide range of different symptoms.
Enough of that. And those symptoms have been with me for going on 5 years now, and they probably will be with me for the rest of my life. Now, I'll get back shortly. Actually, I'll leave this open, the global challenges of long COVID. I don't remember what it was. I had a percent highlighted here somewhere. I think it was this part, but this is one of the key things I wanted to highlight in this. I'll get to this in a second. But the key thing I want to point out here is the first and foremost function of a government is to protect its people, is to keep them alive. If it can't even do that, a government isn't good for much. If it can't protect them against whether it's a foreign power coming in killing all their people, or it can't protect its people against a virus killing them slowly. It does not matter. That is the first and foremost function of the government, and the government is failing to live up to that responsibility horrendously in the United States. Not only has long COVID not been adequately dealt with, in fact, there's been more research coming out of the UK and Australia, countries with a fraction of the GDP and population of the United States, than there has out of the United States. But Trump went on to disband the long COVID office within a month, or no, sorry, 2 months of him taking office this year. That is ridiculous. He's also talking about cutting the U.S. medical research budget in half, and he briefly canceled all long COVID study research and then reinstituted the funding 2 days later. So that's kind of part of the chaos he's been doing. He canceled grants that were about to publish. And then again, brought the funding back 2 days later. So no one really knows exactly what was going on there. But it does certainly create uncertainty and does not create a conducive environment for research. Researchers aren't going to want to keep doing research in this field if they worry that their funding could be cut off in the middle of a study in the future, because it very briefly was here. Now, a government that cannot keep its people safe is no government at all, especially a government that ignores these issues, refuses to listen to advocates, erases them, suppresses their voices, pretends the problem is not happening, and is answerable only to the interests of billionaires. That is what the US government is doing. And this is not just a problem in the US. Around the world, governments are under-responding to this problem. Sure, Australia and the UK are doing better than the United States, but they're not doing enough. I was just reading an article in part of my background research for this about how the Netherlands doesn't make their long COVID clinics available to their entire population. It was comparing it to Germany, which does, which there are problems with the German response as well, but that's not one of their problems, at least. They at least make their long COVID clinics available to all sufferers. And 43 to 80% of people that develop an acute infection develop at least this is using one of the looser definitions of long COVID, at least for this paragraph. This is long COVID-like symptoms within the first 3 months. Long COVID properly is usually defined as symptoms lasting more than 3 months, or sometimes you'll see definitions are like 12 weeks or a little bit less. According to the World Health Organization, they use a stricter definition. 10 to 20% of people go on to develop its symptoms. That is lasting long COVID symptoms. 10 to 20% of people infected with the coronavirus that's still around, that's still infecting people every single year, is still continuing to mutate, so it can eventually break through the existing vaccines, and there'll either need to be new ones, or you'll see many, many tens of millions new cases of long COVID, maybe another 100 million easily. This is a lethal situation, and this is a situation of complete irresponsibility of governments around the world. Now, long COVID, persistent COVID symptoms of 12 weeks or more, that is the 12 weeks or more definition I mentioned, which is often used instead of 3 months, because what's a month? It varies. February is shorter than January and so forth. And this is there was found to be very little statistical difference between 90 days and 12 weeks. 12 weeks is 84 days, of course. So 12 weeks is one of the definitions used. It's becoming more common. Threatens individuals, populations, and economies, because this is an economic drain, with an estimated 1.4 million individuals affected in the United Kingdom alone, and 144 million globally. And this names a couple of studies in 2022 that produced this data. They were in the end of 2022, and these studies, if not mistaken, at least one of them was December. The other might have been, let's follow the links. This was November of 2022, and this was not December, November, late fall. That's what that. Yes, they were both in November, or at least that was the publication date. But there's often a delay when things are accepted, when they're published, published out of print. I would have to double check exactly how that worked, but um, they went out in the December issues of certain scientific journals, regardless. So these two studies, but they didn't really impact the discussion of how many people were affected by long COVID. People are still using the early 65 million figure, which I think came out in 2021, or early 2022. And these more definitive, more carefully estimated numbers, they're higher. Which, by the way, because they were done in 2022, it's now 2025, the numbers should be higher than 144 million because there are new cases every single year. So the number now is probably 160 or 180. I read one study that said it could be as much as 300 million people already, based on the incidence of disease and based on very, 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 very low levels of reporting in certain countries, especially in like sub-Saharan Africa and stuff, where people are getting long COVID, it's just not being counted. So we could be looking at 300. It said 300 to 400. I have trouble believing. I shouldn't be a cynic. If I did not include that paper because I didn't want to stage it, but I should not be such. I was trained as a scientist. I was a biologist, and we naturally tend to go with the lower end of estimates. So you can see the problems here. But let's say it's 320 million, okay? 320 million maybe is the real number. 144 are the last definitive studies. Out of a global population of what, 9 billion now? 8? And heading towards 10. It's going to well off of 10, or is it 7 billion now? It's a very large fraction of the global population is my point. And uh, it's not just in the US, but it's affecting millions in the US, millions in the UK. As many as 45 million in the United States have at least minor symptoms, and as many as 14 million have the full complex of symptoms. When you're looking at, when you define long COVID as 3 or more symptoms, I think it's 14.5 million Americans. It's a much lower number in the UK, 1.4 million according to this. I've seen things that estimate it at over 2, but it's a lower number in the United Kingdom because they're a smaller population, and because of different responses, different genetics, different levels of poverty. Because it's been found when people have COVID and they're poor, they're more likely to develop long COVID. It's suggested that may be due to differences in diet, stress levels, overall health. Although actually healthier individuals seem to get some of the worst cases of long COVID. But it may be if you're unhealthy, you get mild cases at a higher incidence. And certain ethnic groups like Latinos get it at a higher rate than white people. So there's fewer Latinos in the UK. But this is a and by the way, that could have to do with things like what diseases are common in Latin America. There's still genetic pressures exerted by diseases that ravage in Latin America, but also it could be a prior exposure thing where people immigrated and they'd been exposed to certain viruses that raise the risk, certain other viruses that aren't coronavirus. There's a lot of possible reasons for that. Could be due to inferior access to healthcare, could be due to class. Our estimate of this paper is, maybe this is the one I had the percentage highlighted, is we estimate that approximately 18.5 million adults in the U.S. population were experiencing long COVID symptoms persisting for more than 4 weeks after the most recent SARS-CoV-2 infection that were not explained by something else as of July 2022. Our estimate of 7.3% is consistent with the U.S. Household Pulse study, which estimated that 7.5% of U.S. adults are currently experiencing long COVID. So this is putting it not 14.5, but 18.5 million adults in the United States. You can see there's many estimates, and as people get more data, it becomes clear the numbers are higher. Because when you don't know something, you often in biology and epidemiology will estimate on the low end of what the range of possibilities is. And it's a range. So very often the real number is in the middle or at the upper end of a range, and you estimate at the low end. So you underestimate things until you know what they actually are. This is why numbers always seem to climb when you look at the scientific publications. If you're not a scientist and you're ever confused by it, it's not that scientists don't know their stuff, it's that we intentionally go with the low end of estimates for anything that's unknown. Uh, thought there was something here about the global incidence, but you don't really need to. Just 7.5% of U.S. adults. The global rate's going to be lower because United States has had more COVID infections, more repeat infections due to worse public health. But even if it's 6% of the global population, that is an enormous number of people. Absolutely enormous. That's where you get over 400 million levels. So maybe it's a little less than that. 300, 400 million may be a correct estimate. This is, anyways, an enormous problem. An absolutely enormous problem. Between 325 and 600 million would probably live with long COVID. So this study may put as many as 600 million people worldwide. My back of the napkin math, I just gave a number of around 480 million. That is 6%, since an 8 billion population globally. I think the global population is a little more than that. 6% is probably low. It's a huge problem. There's people like me who can't work because we're too sick with long COVID. Many. There's people who are bedbound. At least I can move around the house. Once in a while, go for a walk around the block, though it'll tire me out the rest of the day. Or a very easy hike up a hill, and then I'll be tired the rest of the week. Went dancing at a wedding once, and I could barely move for a whole month after that. So you gives an idea of my levels of energy. But there are people who can't get out of bed ever with this disease. This is killing people, and the death toll is often probably not including people who give up on life, who spiral, who suicide. I could not find good statistics on that, but I bet some of those people were bedbound, had been bedbound for the last 4 years. They probably killed themselves by now, and more of them will. This is a disease that is not being dealt with adequately, and there's a fierce moral urgency to deal with this. There are so many people's lives who have been destroyed. It is not only that, but it is a state of suffering. It's not just physical symptoms like headaches I can never get rid of. I have one right now, but it's on the low end of the headaches I have, or I wouldn't even probably be able to talk right now. I can get some serious migraines. The fatigue, the exhaustion, these things hurt, but it also hurts the way that people end up treating you with this disease. I just dealt with someone on social media who was explaining my long-term dream what had been to be a doctor, and they didn't probably read what I wrote very carefully. And then they're like, becoming a doctor takes time, which is obviously a snipe at my age, where I'm turning 36. Of course, uh, if not for developing long COVID, I would have already entered med school about 4 years ago. I would be in my final year of medical school now, if not for this disease. Or maybe if I took a year between, I'd be at the end of a third year. So and that would have happened because I was at the top of a special master's program, 4.0, perfect grades, had completed all the courses of a special master's and was moving to courses for another master's. I was, well, moving into. Now that would imply I was in the beginning. I was finishing courses for another master's that went along with it. All I had left was research for the special master's, like research projects, which was harder to do in the middle of the pandemic, but I was making progress towards that, and might have had to resort to library thesis in the end because the research project I was doing in a hospital, it was did not go well because of poor communication with the professor not being able to actually come into the office. He wanted more frequent email updates, but he never told me he wanted more frequent email updates he was getting. Uh, anyways, but yeah, I would have, maybe if there were some delays in the research, I'd be in the end of a third year of an MD at this point. Or if I took a little time to work, save up a little more money. The point being is there's immense symbolic violence against those on COVID. For a long time, I was reading a number of articles about the psychologicalization of the illness. which is an attempt to make people think that long COVID is all in their head. That was very common the first couple years in 2020 to 2022, where there was a certain segment that had been, quote, radicalized. There was, I went for more of the hard epidemiology studies there, but there were some more public health kind of psychology articles, those kind of things that talked about this. And an opinion article in a major medical journal by a physician talking about this, about a certain segment was radicalized to believe that it was all in the heads of the patients who were suffering from this, similar to the way that chronic Epstein-Barr virus, that is the disease that causes monochronic Lyme disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, MECFS as myalgic encephalitis, chronic fatigue symptom. Some of these other diseases with similar symptomology to long COVID, at least some shared symptoms, have been victimized before with people claiming that the people had it was just in their head. It's not. They were just much rarer diseases, so it was easier to ignore than a disease that could easily affect 300, 400 million people around the globe, and we know it affects at least 144 million. These were diseases with a global footprint of less than a million people, many of them. So it was, or a million, 2 million. I think CFS is the biggest, and I think that was like 3 million people, 4 million worldwide. And it was erased, and people with disease are pushed into the shadows and into poverty and into depression and very often into suicide because they had been ignored by society. It had been treated as it's not real. Uh, it's wrong. It's wrong how I had to deal with this physician, actually, because some people go into medicine are psychopaths, and this particular physician didn't even do their medical training in the U.S., so who knows what kind of standards of admission they had there where she went. But I think this person might have come from Taiwan, which is a country with some deep problems. It's a U.S. puppet state, and one that's committed genocide on the native population of the island it's on, has erased that, claims that it's the legitimate government of all China, yet at the same time has the U.S. protect them against Chinese expansionism when China wants to unite the country again. So I've got some critiques of that country, and someone coming out of there to be this toxic is not entirely surprising to me. But there are all sorts of people I've seen act this way, though that's one of the few physicians, at least someone on social media claimed to be a physician, because, you never know. These people, this person could be someone who works at a convenience store and claims to be a physician. This disease is destroying lives. This disease is not being dealt with. And there is a fierce moral urgency, as much as there was ending segregation in the U.S. South, as much as there was ending slavery, even, to liberate people from this disease, to actually deal with it. Because when it is killing people and making them suffer fates that many people would rightly say is a fate worse than death. Honestly, this disease sucks in many ways worse than if I just killed over. I will stubbornly stick with this, but there are many, many people who will not endure this in the hope that there'll be a cure someday. That's the only possible way at the end of the tunnel. This disease must be dealt with. And the fact that it hasn't is a failure of the system. It's an indictment of capitalism, which is the global system at this point. So we can squarely point the finger at that. It's an indictment of capitalism as well as an indictment of specifically capitalism as neoliberal variant, which is most of the globe, and an indictment of these so-called bourgeois democracies. They ignore the wills of the people and are effectively oligarchies. There was a study that showed the U.S. government was effectively just an oligarchy, and those results were replicated with many other countries using the same statistical methods, including showing that Germany is just an oligarchy. And most of all, when you combine this with climate change, this is an indictment of a complete lack of foresight in our system and an unwillingness to deal with big problems in favor of only dealing with the problems that affect the very, very, very rich and powerful. Um, and with diseases, sometimes not even, because the chance any individual billionaire would get long COVID, low, especially because they are able to create bubbles around themselves so they don't get COVID in the first place. Um, much more effective bubbles than you or me will ever have. Uh, although I'm sure when there are a few billionaires who've gone long COVID, there'll be a little more attention to disease, but that might not be for a while. There's probably one on the planet somewhere right now. One is my guess, maybe two. So, anyways, out of what, 2,000 billionaires globally, getting towards three, um, most of them have probably insulated themselves from getting COVID in the first place, and some who didn't, not everyone who gets COVID gets long COVID. So, demand change. Or push back against the oligarchy, which is what's allowing these huge issues of climate change and long COVID to be ignored. Push back against it. If you're in the United States, you gotta demand big changes. I hold that the only way democracy is going to be saved, and the only way that people are going to see a better world is if Americans demand a new constitutional convention, because we need to make a number of amendments to the Constitution. It's not feasible to make like 12 or 20 amendments to the Constitution in the near future. The only way you can do this, and the Founding Fathers provided a mechanism for this, is to hold a new constitutional convention where you can sit down and slap out 12, 20 constitutional amendments all at once, because that's the kind of thing, level of change is going to need to happen to deal with climate change appropriately, to prevent the U.S. from sliding into fascism, and to deal with oligarchy, to deal with problems like long COVID. If you want a better world, you need to push for radical change in the world. Um, or you can ignore it. You can watch the Marxist Leninists. They'll increase the number, and they'll probably eventually do some revolutions around the world, and fascists, and you'll just see a kind of a repeat of World War II, war between Marxist Leninists and fascists, where democracy will die in more and more of the world. That where the U.S. makes it all about itself, but the biggest front in World War II is between the Soviet Union and the Axis powers, the Eastern Front. That's where the majority of land combat occurred in the at least with the Axis. Then there was also Japan with the U.S. And Japan with China, but the world's going to be end up in a very dark place, and then climate catastrophe is going to eventually wipe out billions if people don't act. So demand radical change. Wake up. If you're listening to this, you cannot be a good person and continue to ignore these problems, to ignore the hundreds of millions, because it is probably more than 200 million, and probably in that 3 to 4 range, if I'm being completely honest. You cannot ignore the at least 100, probably hundreds of millions with long COVID, the climate change catastrophes that's likely to wipe out at least a couple billion humans, and oligarchy and fascism. These problems must be dealt with, and if you abdicate responsibility to deal with them, if you say it's not my problem, I have too much stress in my life, I can't deal with it, you're a bad person. All right. Well, I wish you folks the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. Um, I know you can do better and stuff, and all I'm asking is you commit to deal with these things someday, soon. It doesn't have to be that you instantly go out and do a great deal, but you cannot say it's not my problem. You can't. It is your problem. Um, but be kind to yourselves, and may you always find a guiding star to lead you home. Until next time, this is Northstar. Adieu, and best luck.